Mountain America will never call you directly asking for your personal information.
As a financial institution, we will never call you to gather information from you. Usually, if we call you, is to verify some activity that is happening on your account without asking you to provide your own information. However, sometimes if you call us, we might ask you to provide this information, and that's the right flow for this information to be provided.
Welcome back to Guiding You Forward. I'm Chase Christensen, and today we're joined by Mountain America's VP of Fraud Management and Operations, Subhi Salim. Thanks for joining me today.
You're glad to be here.
So I just wanted to start out by talking to you about kind of what the fraud landscape looks like. A lot of our viewers have probably run into fraud in their daily lives. That just seems like a common occurrence in today's technology environment. What does that look like for you in your role? Is there any certain vector that you guys are kind of monitoring the most, or is it just kind of all over the place?
So as far as landscape, it's not necessarily that the fraud volume has increased over time. However, the fraud sophistication has increased. So fraud becoming more harder and more expensive to detect.
Okay.
Consumers has reported over $12.5 billion in losses in 2024, which is an increase of about 25% from the year before.
Wow.
ID theft is still one of the highest fraud categories that we keep seeing consistently year over year. Number of fraud reported when it comes to ID theft was over 1 million, and that's consistent with other years. However, what we've seen is that the fraudsters are able to make it more profitable using the new technologies like AI and using that framework to basically make things look more real, more normal. From highly synthetic text, highly suspicious emails, or creating fake IDs, or using deep fake to generate voices that look similar to legitimate people. All these things help the fraudsters basically become more sophisticated. And that's the main takeaway. I don't think the fraud itself changed as much. The technique's still the same. Everything's still the same. However, what changed is the sophistication. A fraud now is more smarter than before, and it's harder to detect. What we used to call traditional red flags that you can put your hand on and able to detect fraud, some of it are no longer valid, or no longer used by a sophisticated fraudster, becoming more business as usual. And that's what makes it more hard to detect.
Gotcha. Is there, I guess backing up even a little bit before that, at what point does it become blatant fraud to you guys to investigate? And, is it just somebody trying to fake an identity, get into accounts? Like, is there a definition for you guys for that? Or is it just kind of across the board, just unauthorized access to anything is something that you guys consider to be fraud?
Yeah, so the main pillar for any fraud that we look at is always looking something different than normal behavior.
Okay.
What is it, whether it's for that consumer or whether for the whole population that we are dealing with. Usually, if you track the trend of any customer or member or consumer, you're always going to see like a similar pattern for each one of them. And that pattern, usually people don't tend to change that as much. And in the fraud scenarios, you see a spike in activities that are out of norm for that member. For example, if they log in during certain hours and somehow the fraudster got access to their account, in some scenarios you would find the fraudsters logging into after hours, midnight, things of that sort, where it's out of norm for that member.
Right.
And at that point, we can start investigating and looking at things and looking closely to see what other attributes or indicators that we can look at to determine if it's the member who is doing these activities or not.
Right. And that's what you would consider red flags. Like, these would be signs that account activity is unusual.
Exactly. So there's a lot of things that we could look at as a red flag. And those are the ones that guide us to determine if there's fraud happening on this account, or if there's suspicious activities happening on this account.
Right.
And those what we can use as our guiding principle to basically protect the member, come up with the right solutions, and also take the right steps with our members to protect them from this fraud that is happening on their account.
Right. So you mentioned AI, obviously, being a huge factor for all of this, but are there certain channels or mediums that you're seeing it applied to most, like email, text? Like how are some of these fraudsters kind of implementing that?
AI is becoming very sophisticated right now, and it applies to all channels.
Mm-hmm.
We've seen the fraudsters using AI across all channels, whether it's via text or email or phone calls.
Okay.
And each one comes with its own red flags and own techniques on how they do their scam. So take an example as emails, for example. They send you that email that looks perfect, looks very legitimate. Oftentimes, you wouldn't find any red flag other than the sender and misspelled email address in it. And it looks exactly similar to the one that you would get from your institution. Phone numbers, oftentimes they would spoof your phone number,
Right.
and they would do a deep fake voice with a familiar voice to you, and use that to basically call you and make you trust them to
Wow.
give out your information and basically give them access to your account. When it comes to texting, is another problem area where we've seen the fraudsters sending very clean texts that look exactly like the one that you would get from your institution. And it would sound something similar to, did you authorize this purchase, yes or no? And you would respond to that. And the minute you respond to that, the scammer jump quickly on that and start basically lower you in to provide more information and verify the transactions, provide your one-time verification code that they can use eventually to basically log into your accounts and move money or open new loans under your name and do different things with that.
Wow. So what I'm hearing you say is AI is kind of enabling a lot of the fraudsters because, we haven't talked about a lot of the red flags, but I guess we can incorporate that here. Is a lot of the red flags used to be typos in emails, typos in text messages, weird addresses, weird phrasings of things, but that AI is enabling that to be more authentic, proofing those things, making them feel just like they are coming from your financial institution. Is that kind of how AI is being applied across the board, is just to make this a more realistic scam overall?
Yeah, 100%. So basically, what we are seeing that the scammers or the fraudsters, they are leveraging that in a way that make it look very familiar to you.
Right.
So if something you've seen before, something your institution usually sent to you, in a way that make you believe it and trust it right away, especially when you're interacting with it very fast.
Mm-hmm.
The tendency as human, if something looks familiar to us, we tend to trust it more
Right.
and move quickly on it.
Okay.
So there is definitely some of the traditional red flag that we used to know.
Mm-hmm.
Like to your point, they don't apply anymore. So misspelled emails or logos that they look off and things of that sort, that's no longer valid in most cases. So now you see things that are looking very legitimate and things that you can you need to do a lot of digging before you can tell this is fraudulent.
Sure.
or fake. So
Do you think that will swing back kind of past? And I guess I mean by this is some people had actually tried this out and they had intentionally put typos in their ads to make them feel more authentic, because the human brain is saying like, oh, there's a typo in that. That was probably an actual human that mistyped that. It's not AI. It's not generated. And they actually performed better than the ad set without a typo in it. They tested them against each other. Do you think that these smaller, like little imperfections that you are actually engaging with a human will actually become more like green flags rather than red flags that, oh, this isn't perfect, this might be an actual human? Or do you think there's danger in that as well?
and there is definitely that possibility. And it's bringing a really good thought there where technically, how do you know it's a human versus machine?
Right. Yeah.
And it's a big question right now across the industry, because technically everyone uses AI, the fraudsters and also legitimate people.
Sure.
So the more things that could look human, the things where it's not so perfect, to your point. And maybe at some point that's going to be the case. If there is like misspelled words, there is errors here and there, that makes it more look more human.
Right.
However, we know fraudsters, they always catch on a trend. If that's going to be the new trend, then probably
they'll catch
that's what they're going to do.
Yeah, fair enough.
Yeah.
What are the main things that you would suggest as we move into this era of AI that you would suggest to people that are still consistent red flags that they can catch and kind of avoid some of this fraud?
There's definitely still a few things that we can do. So take the text as an example. So while maybe the messaging itself and the content will look great and it will look similar to something you get from your institution, I advise people to look at the phone number, the sender, like where it's coming from.
Right.
Oftentimes, the phone number will not look similar to the phone numbers that or the short codes that you receive some telemarketing from your company.
Right.
So it will look a little bit different. In emails, no matter what they do, they can get the email itself perfect. But if we look at the sender, they probably going to have misspelled domain in the sender name, because that's
or an odd domain. That's,
odd domain, exactly. So where they cannot spoof that domain in most cases. Take phone as an example as well. Phone probably is the easiest to detect off of the two, because even AI could clone someone's voice and make it look absolutely similar to that voice.
Right.
If you watch the rhythm over the sound, you would find differences. The pace itself will seem off a little bit. And you would find some other clues like pauses in the wrong places or strange places. You would find the emotional cues within the conversation doesn't come as natural.
Right.
And then it would sound very flat versus a normal conversation. So there's more clues that you can find when you get a scam call. So
right. And I guess this is probably a good reminder that I assume most financial institutions, but I know Mountain America will never call you directly asking for your personal information right away, right? Which is always a good differentiator between those. Maybe a red flag is that they're reaching out to you and asking for this personal information right away.
So that's definitely a trend we have seen, where the fraudsters will call pretending to be the fraud department of Mountain America.
Right.
And sometimes they wouldn't have the member information, and sometimes they do. They would have their name, the last four of their card, and sometimes they know some recent transaction they've done. And those information, they use them to basically build trust with the member.
Right.
And sometimes they wouldn't have those. The point of doing all of these things is to build that trust and use people emotion, basically, as that's their main target. And once they establish that trust with the member, they move on to the next phase, which is basically, I have other suspicious activities that I want to verify with you.
Right.
So you make up other transactions that the member never did.
Right.
And ask them to provide the verification code or the one-time code that we sent to their phones. And pretending that they're going to use that code to basically lock their account and cancel the fraudulent transaction and do all that work. When in reality, they use that code to just log into their account and do other activities that the member didn't authorize.
Right. You touched on something that I wanted to give you the example of. So my brother is a pretty smart guy, and I think we're pretty used to fraud affecting a lot of vulnerable communities. Maybe older people have a lot of this just because they're not as familiar with modern systems and everything. But my brother had this happen. He's a data scientist for eBay, so pretty up to speed on technology and all of that. But he had that happen where from his financial institution, he got a call where they were saying, hey, there's been fraud detected on your account. can we verify some purchases with you? And they gave him like 2 or 3 of his recent purchases, which were correct, and then gave him a fraudulent one. And he's like, yeah, that's not me. And they're like, let's go through some processes. And they basically had him authorize a payment sending technology inside of his account that he then authorized and sent a bunch of money away because they could jump in and do it that way. And that's not as easily coverable by a credit union or a financial institution, right? Because essentially it looks like you have now authorized all of this stuff because you've given away your information. And I was just curious, he's still to this day is like, I don't know how they did this, and that he fell for it. But I know it was a trend. It was in the news there for a little while. And I guess I'm not asking how, but with it being that convincing, do you still try to apply the hang up and call your financial institution, or what do you do in those circumstances with it getting more and more convincing like that?
As a financial institution, we will never call you to gather information from you, especially the information that we know about you. Usually, if we call you, is to verify some activity that is happening on your account without asking you to provide your own information. However, sometimes if you call us, we might ask you to provide this information, and that's the right flow for this information to be provided.
Right, it's kind of inbound rather than outbound.
Exactly.
Okay,
Yep.
Gotcha. I don't know how familiar our viewers are with this, but I personally hear them fairly frequently, and granted, I work at a credit union, but you probably hear these quite a bit out and about as well. Phishing, social engineering. Are these different types of fraud? Like, how would you explain that to the layperson that's maybe not dealing with fraud every day, the difference between social engineering and phishing and these other fraud terms?
Phishing is the tool, and social engineering is the manipulation. Think of phishing as is a delivery method to basically collect your information. So the fraudster or the scammer might be sending you a text or an email and ask you to click a link or download an email. And the point of that is just to collect your personal data. And then after that, social engineering part comes in, where they use the collected information to manipulate you psychologically and ask you and pressure you to provide more access to your accounts and
Gotcha.
to all your finances. And that's what they're going to use to basically create transactions, maybe book loans under your name, and do different things. But generally speaking, I would say phishing is under the umbrella of social engineering, and it's the method that they use to get to the social engineering.
Gotcha. So phishing would be kind of broader information collecting, right? Like we've mentioned with texts or emails, of sending this out to a wide audience, seeing who engages with it, seeing whose information I can just start getting, and that additional social engineering would be used from there to provide additional information, and then essentially pretend to be somebody that you're not, or get login details or anything like that. That's kind of what I'm hearing you say, right?
Correct. Yep.
Okay. We mentioned this earlier, but we mentioned spoofing, again, another word that people may or may not be familiar with. What is spoofing, and what are the concerns there?
So spoofing is a terminology used when someone create a fake website or uses a phone number that look similar to the legitimate identity of either a person or institution. And we see that a lot in scams, where fraudsters or scammers spoof your financial institution phone number and use that to call you. So you would trust that the person or the agent that is calling you from that phone number.
Right.
Similar to that, when they send you phishing links, and those sometimes either look exactly similar to your institution link, with changing just one letter here or there, or changing, just moving things around a little bit, but it would look almost similar or identical to your company's website. And within these websites, you would find often that they mimic the whole page. It looks exactly the same. They often copy the same
Wow.
logos, the same pictures, the same verbiage, and they migrate that to that website. And the whole point is to make it look familiar. And the minute it looks familiar, like what we said earlier, when things look familiar to us and we are acting fast, then we tend to trust things a lot more, and we tend to provide a lot more.
Gotcha. And so with that, are there any red flags that come up with spoofing that you can use to identify those, right? So if I'm getting a call and it looks just like my financial institution's phone number, or I visit a website that looks exactly like the landing page of my financial institution, is there anything that's easily identifiable to say, I don't really trust this? I mean, going back to the phone call, I guess it would be listening to the intonation and the urgency of the call and everything. But maybe what about the website? Are there any best practices for maybe detecting that is not your financial institution's?
So basically, to your point, when it comes to phone, and it comes similar, the phone number will look similar to your financial institution. To your point, like listen to the voice, listen to the rhythm. If someone is pressuring you to provide information, creating urgency, asking you to provide the code multiple times, and you see that there is some work happening in the background, those are definitely red flags that I would encourage people to stop, take their time to think about the scenario and what's happening, and hang up. If you have this gut feeling that there is something is off, always hang up. Call your financial institution, not on the same phone number you just hang up on. Like try to go to the website, call the official phone number, contact your direct advisor if you have one, and verify everything with them. Now, on the website side of things, no matter what they do, they always have to change the link itself, and they would have, like mentioned, either one letter that would be misspelled, or moving things around a little bit, so the dot will not be where you usually find it to be.
Right.
Things of that sort that will tell you that the link itself is not looking great. Now, let's say that you click the link, and unfortunately provided your username and your password and other information, and then the minute you log in, you would not see your account. So because it's a fake website, all they did there, they just collected your username and your password.
Right.
And they're gonna and that's just a compromise situation where they're gonna use this information for later on to do fraudulent activities. So you still have time. All I advise people to do, immediately close that page and call your fraud department right away and inform them about the situation, so they can perform the different security things that we do to protect your account. Additionally, I advise people always to take their computer and check it with professionals to make sure that there is no malware or nothing got impacted by this activity.
Gotcha. With the login, at least for me, sometimes I imagine somebody just cracking my password, right? Brute forcing it or whatever it is. But do you guys see that a lot, or is it mostly the social engineering, getting you to click on a link, getting you to provide your own details? Is that typically what you're seeing, or is there, a factor of people that are, more or less brute forcing their way in or cracking passwords, and how important is it to still, observe those best practices from a password standpoint to make sure it's strong and not easily identifiable that way?
You mentioned a strong point there where, as you know, every company you go to, you want to use their web services, you have to have a username and password. And oftentimes, people will recycle those across different websites, which make it easier for the fraudster to find those, view different data breaches.
Right.
And
more vulnerable in case it gets leaked somewhere else.
Exactly.
Right.
And it's not necessarily with your institution. It could be with another institution. And then
sure.
Once the fraudster find that out, they take those username and password and attempt to use them across different websites.
Right.
That's why it's important always to create complicated passwords and do not recycle them as much. Create a unique password for each website. That's what I would recommend.
Okay.
On top of that, username and password are the least kind of security that you can set up on your account.
Right.
Adding multi-factor authentication actually is the better security for your account. It's basically a lock on top of a lock. However, this lock is the bigger lock that it's hard to crack.
Right.
Given that every time you get a new code that the fraudsters or the scammer, they do not have access to, and that's going to be unique to you at any point in time, and that's the best way for you to make sure that your account is secure. So multi-factor authentication right now is optional, but I feel like eventually it should be mandatory for everything you do, given that password cannot be trusted.
And it's fairly simple, right? It's typically like email or text based, right? When you log in with your password, and then it has another factor where it says, "Hey, we'll send you a code via text message or email, for you to provide that code." And I assume that's pretty hard to fake, with you personally having to have a device, in order to log in. That's kind of the thought behind it, right? Is that it's much harder for them to get past that second phase of kind of personal identification with you having to verify it with a device, or even, something like Google Authenticator or Microsoft Authenticator or something like that. Is that the general idea with the multi-factor authentication?
Correct. So basically, it's one of the most secure method.
Mm-hmm.
It's been one of the top drivers for account takeover loss reduction across the industry.
Right.
We still see compromises here and there, and that's for what we've talked about earlier: scammers calling you, or getting the code from you,
asking for codes,
or somehow hacking into your iCloud, or the different systems where you receive those SMS texts. But generally speaking, it's been one of the best methods to reduce account takeover losses across the industry.
Do you feel like biometric authentication is a kind of a suitable replacement for password stuff? Do you feel like that is more secure than maybe username and password? I know Mountain America, obviously, you're able to enable access with biometrics via the app. Is that something you view as more secure than just name and password, or still worthwhile having the two-factor authentication even if you have biometrics enabled?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think biometrics, whether it's your Face ID, whether it's your fingerprints, those are unique to you as well.
Right.
And definitely hard to fake right now. We haven't heard of cases where fraudster was able to fake those. Definitely stronger than username and password, which, like what we talked about.
But who knows what AI is going to be capable of in the future,
exactly,
right? Replicating your face is not unheard of at this point, so...
Yeah, and luckily the fraudsters and scammers that are using AI, we are using it too. We are making sure we are getting the best technology to basically protect our members from the scammers, and we are advancing in AI in a way that we're not allowing them to basically penetrate our system using AI.
So I just wanted to ask you, what is the most sophisticated case of fraud you have seen up till now?
A member received a call from their financial institution, and the phone number was spoofed, so it looked similar to their branch phone number.
Okay.
And when the fraudster called the member or the scammer, they were able to basically provide their name, the last four of their card, and also verify one of the transactions that they've done recently. So they provided all this information to the member, so the member was trusting them just because they provided good information.
Yeah.
And based off of that, that's the very first phase of the scheme. And the second phase was, okay, well, I built this trust. Let me now see how I can create the panic and the fear and the urgency to do something. So they start asking them about other transaction types, and they are totally made up transaction. They never occurred. And they asked them, do you do those? And the member said, no, I didn't. Then immediately the scammer jumped in and said, okay, let me help you cancel those fraudulent transactions, lock down your account so no more money can leave your account, and things of that sort. and I'm gonna send you a one-time passcode. So if you could please read it back to me, and of course they did, and they used that passcode to log into their account,
Right.
and immediately start transferring funds from their account, and technically that's a devastating situation to our member, given that they're in a place where they trusted the person. They thought they are legitimately calling from the fraud department of their institution, and made it easy to the fraudster to basically, or the scammer to basically conduct their scam.
So in situations like this with that kind of fraud, where it's maybe this social engineered fraud and you maybe willingly gave away your login credentials and these codes and everything, does that make it harder on Mountain America's side to help make these people whole again and kind of deal with the fraud, since from our end it's hard to tell whether this was an unauthorized login and whether that all looks like fraud? Does that make it difficult for our teams to do that?
Fraud prevention is a joint effort between us and our members, and member awareness is the best fraud defense that we could ever have. The more our members know about fraud, know about scam and their techniques, the better that we are able to protect their accounts. And in these situations, definitely we encourage our members to be aware, to not give as much information to the fraudsters, to limit the interaction with them as much as they could. And like mentioned earlier, even if a scammer called you and you're in the middle of it, and then you're realizing there's something is off, I encourage people to always hang up right away, call your financial institution, because that's the best way to prevent the fraud from happening.
Right.
And that definitely makes our life easier in the fraud prevention world, because the less we give the fraudsters and the scammers, the better we can protect these accounts.
Right. The next one I wanted to ask you about was, I've heard of this, and it feels maybe the most crazy and crazy to, I'm sure, possible viewers, but I'm sure this will get more sophisticated with AI. But they get a call from Mexico, right? And a loved one is on vacation, and they get this emergency request, like, your loved one's been in an accident, they're in the hospital, they need these funds, we need you to wire us this money. How often does that happen, and what do you do in those scenarios? Is it just as simple as trying to get a hold of that family member, or are there recommendations? I mean, that's crazy to me, and I've heard examples even where they're now spoofing voices, right? And saying like, oh, I'm hurt, I'm in the hospital, I need you to send me this money. Are there maybe best practices to apply to those situations too, where it's this, possibly fake emergency, but the fear of that being real, is driving some of that? Are there best practices you would apply to a situation like that?
It actually, these kind of trends happens quite often.
Mm-hmm.
And we've seen it a lot last year, different scenarios, but in similar lines, where the fraudster or scammer would call the members or the consumer and create that urgency that we mentioned before. And the main point is creating the panic and the fear in them, and use things that could make them interact quickly with us.
Mm-hmm.
And to your point, some of them utilize AI, and the point of using AI, and all they need sometimes just 3 seconds of audio that they can use it to clone someone's voice.
That's
and use
crazy.
that. Yeah, and use that to basically just talk to you.
To mimic someone.
Yeah, to mimic someone and make it sound like is that person that you're expecting a call from.
Right.
And in these scenarios, we need to always apply logic. I know as a human, when things look familiar, I go back to that point, we tend to trust more and to give more and lower our guards right away.
Right.
With in this world and with AI and everything we mentioned, it's always best to take it slow and think before actioning anything. And the easiest thing you can do and the best thing you can do is always hang up and call directly to a trusted phone number, to another family member, reach out via other social media means, and you will definitely find your answer.
Just really verify this, yeah.
Yep, and one of the key red flags that you always you see with the scammers, the minute you say, I want to hang up, I want to think, I want to verify, almost always they don't want that. They're gonna push back. They're gonna try to keep you on the phone. They're gonna keep trying to create that urgency and the fear and the panic, and that's immediately your red flag is right there. That's where you know like there is something off about this whole thing.
Gotcha. Okay, that's good advice. Would you apply, and I guess maybe using your help to describe this to romance scams, right? How would you define what a romance scam is? Do you guys see this a lot?
Yeah, actually, that's been a common trend since the day I worked in fraud. It's
okay.
It never changed. Different techniques, different tools, but it's always the same. It's just you got and it's always the same story where someone knows someone overseas, never seen them before.
Right.
And somehow they became their either boyfriend or girlfriend, and they're sending them money to help them,
Developed
or they
a
want
relationship, right? Yeah.
Yeah, and there is scenarios where the member or the consumer would have the money and send it over to them, and those are very devastating.
Sure.
And there's other scenarios where they don't have any money, but these scammers would send them fake checks or fake wire or fake ACH, and then
ask them to cash it.
Ask them to cash it and send it over to them.
Right.
And we've seen both, and still a trend that it's happening. And just advise people always stay away from these kind of activities as much as you could.
Right.
And then never if there's something that you didn't see in person, you didn't verify in person, it's better to stay away from trying to interact with them with money situations.
Right. This is a good segue for me. So, from what I understand, our teams are kind of trained to detect that type of scam. Right. I've heard of tellers being like, ooh, that looks a little suspicious, right? That we now have kind of sent this much money over time, or even in talking with a member of just, asking some questions about like, oh, why are we sending this money, and maybe helping detect some of that fraud. So it's a good segue into, I'm sure we're doing a ton, but what are the main things that you feel like Mountain America is doing right now to help protect members from these types of frauds that we're just trying to identify as quickly as they come?
So at Mountain America, we have a lot of tools that's running in the background, and they're interacting quietly with everything that the member is doing, whether it's online, whether it's in branch, or whether via call center.
Right. Even team training.
Yeah,
right.
even that. So we have a lot of tools, a lot of technology. We invest heavily in member security, and we make sure we get the best-in-class tools in order to protect our members. We take their security very seriously. We have different things that monitor transactions in real time. We have behavioral analytics, and we have AI models and different things, and all of it work together in order to protect the member. Most of the time, nobody will feel anything, and that's the goal.
That's the idea.
Make it very seamless for our members. You could to do all the transactions safely, with the speed and timely that you need, and without having any issues or any problem or friction while you're doing these transactions.
And that's kind of what you were talking about earlier, is us applying AI kind of on the good side of that to help detect some of these fraudsters using AI for bad, right?
Yeah.
Sounds like Mountain America is doing quite a bit to help keep our members safe and secure, but it also sounds like what we're doing right now, the financial education side of it, is a huge factor in that, and just driving that awareness and what these scams look like. Do you think it's important for families to have these conversations? Because it sounds like we're not dealing with, vulnerable people as much anymore with maybe, senior citizens or, children. Everybody's kind of susceptible to this. So do you think it's important to have these conversations, as maybe families or friends or whatever to share this information and drive that kind of awareness of these scams?
Yeah, absolutely. I think fraud prevention is always a joint effort, and sometimes it's a community effort. One team or one company cannot do it all by themselves. So first, like spreading around this education and letting people know about what we are seeing in the industry. And I encourage people, our members, to basically take this knowledge, share it with their loved ones, with their friends, with their family, spread the message across, because to your point, it is not just affecting one segment. It's affecting everyone. Everyone is susceptible to fraud, and everybody could be frauded. Those scammers, they don't know young, old, they don't care, basically. They're after everyone, and whoever has something valuable, they're after that. So spreading the message in the community is very important, and I'm very supportive of doing all of that.
Great. Do you think, I think this was helpful for me, but even sharing, being vulnerable enough to share that you were scammed and sharing those anecdotes and the tactics that they took could be helpful as well. Because I know, the story I gave about my brother, he wasn't necessarily wanted to be like, oh, I got tricked, but him sharing that information with me made me like double take and was like, oh, I would fall for that, and made me realize, cool, well, I learned some things from this. And I think as humans, those anecdotes, right, is primarily from an evolutionary standpoint, kind of how we learn to avoid things. Yeah. So do you feel like it's important to even share those anecdotes of, I did get scammed and here's how it happened and here's how you can kind of avoid it in the future?
Yeah, I definitely believe in word of mouth. Is definitely one of the strongest thing you can ever offer anyone. And sometimes, to your point, if you didn't experience something, your family didn't experience it, sometimes you tend to think that you probably will never experience it.
Right.
And hearing those experiences from people that are close to you, then that will make you think twice again. They will make you think, okay, that happened to them. That could happen to me.
Right.
So technically, it'll make you more aware. It will make you more put your guards up again, and make sure that you're protecting yourself from scams and fraudsters. Whatever
helps you move past that, like, oh, I would never fall for something like that, right?
Exactly.
When you see people that you respect and look up to that have also fallen for these things.
Absolutely, and fraud today is not as normal as used to be. It wasn't this sophisticated as before. So we moved from fraud is very sketchy, is easy to detect, to now it's business as usual. Like it almost feels normal, and you wouldn't know until after the fact.
Right. So if you do end up falling for one of these things, right, you apply your best practices, you try to spot it, but unfortunately, it's just very convincing. What are your next steps? We discussed earlier, calling your financial institution if you click on maybe a web page and realize once you've submitted your financial information would be prudent. But is there anything else that you would recommend, for keeping your safe? Like maybe checking your credit report or anything like that? Would you have suggestions for if you fall for something, what to look for, and maybe some other proactive steps for just kind of monitoring?
So if you were ever fell to a scam or been in a fraud situation, my advice always to call all your financial institutions, make sure that your accounts are safe, change your username and password, add MFA, which is very important step. Start adding those everywhere you can.
Right.
And turn on some of the services like credit report monitoring, so they notify you if there is ever an account get open under your name. Also, there is new tools on your phone that you can get that could detect calls from scammers.
Interesting.
So those could be very helpful as well to detect them early on, and even sometimes reject the calls. Same for texting. And I would also put a freeze on my credit report, so nobody can open an account without my authorization. Every
Right,
time
so you
they
have to unfreeze it every
unfreeze.
time you apply for credit.
Exactly, exactly. So those are all helpful steps. And we go back to also touch again on the education part. Make sure to spread that out to people. Make sure your community is aware, your family is aware. That way, you protect them as well, not just yourself.
Right. One of the last things I wanted to talk about was maybe some old school frauds. Have you seen any of that circling back? Because I don't know where I heard this, but check fraud used to be a huge thing. I don't know if you've ever seen the movie Catch Me If You Can, but it's all about check fraud, and that's basically how he made it happen. And I know that was a huge thing. But obviously, as we've moved into the digital age, that has kind of ebbed away. But I saw or read something that said that was actually kind of back on the rise because of that. There's a lot of financial institutions are not monitoring that as close as they were, just because it's not as big of a deal. Do you still see any of kind of this old school, wire check fraud that you would traditionally think of frauds until, the dawning of the digital age that we're in now?
What we've seen in the industry is that the check fraud has increased over the years. Year over the years, been going up, and what gone down is the people that using checks legitimately, they start using more of the digital channels.
Right.
Now the fraudsters are using checks because there's a lot of manual processes around checks, and like you mentioned, it's a old school technique of transferring money, and there's gaps in the system that the fraudsters like to take advantage of, and that's why we are keep seeing a spike in those activities. So my advice to our members: always stay away from checks as much as you could. Use other channels. Digital channels are more secure than checks.
Interesting. Mm-hmm. Very cool. And I guess speaking to that too, and I guess this swings back the other way to more modern techniques. In the tradition of maybe skimmers, right? Or RFID interceptors, as far as like tap to pay and everything goes. With you paying in person, are there technologies that you would say are more secure than others? Like, swiping your card is rare, but there's still some instances where chip readers are down or gas pumps are still, some of them are old school and you have to swipe. I'm sure there's technologies, right, that are coming out that intercept chip stuff. I don't know how that works. I guess I'm just asking the question of are there more secure methods than others that you would recommend, or do you feel like across the board inserting your chip is just as secure as tapping to pay, and that's just as secure as like maybe using your phone to pay?
To your point, there is some methods that are more secure than others, but every method that has its own gaps. So let's take, for example,
there's vulnerabilities on all of them.
All of them. Okay. So if you have the physical card that has chip in it, technically you have the keys to the kingdom. So you can technically do chip transactions anywhere. You can tap the card anywhere you want, and then based on the financial institution that you're with and the rules that they set up, then that's what's going to basically protect you at that point. Now, when it comes to tap to pay using Apple and other products like that, they're very secure. It's hard to steal information from those. However, we've seen in the industry where a fraudster could be adding the card detail to their Apple phone, their own Apple phone, Apple Pay, and then use that to basically make payments.
Interesting.
Because every time you add that information, then technically it gets stored to that phone, and then you can start using that phone to basically tap to pay.
Sure.
While it's secure and it's hard for a fraudster or a scammer to get the information from the Apple Pay itself, it's still easy for them to gather the actual information and use it to put in their phone and
Gotcha.
Act like it just...
I see what you're saying.
Yeah,
so harder to intercept at the terminals, right? But just as easy if fraudsters get your information
Yeah.
off of online shopping or a breach or getting into your accounts to add it to Apple Pay and then spend it that way anyways.
Exactly, yeah.
Okay.
Now, Mountain America, we had another level of authentication. So if you were to add a card to your phone, we don't just enable it, we still send you a code basically to your phone, and then you have to put in that code to activate the card, or you give us a call, and when we authenticate you, and then we enable that on your phone.
Right.
So there's just another speed bump we put in there to basically make sure we're provisioning that to the member.
Right. But that side of it is a little bit more secure as well, right?
Yeah.
Do I understand it correctly that even with authenticating it inside of like, Google Pay or Apple Pay or whatever it is, that data is hashed and they don't actually kind of store your credit card number there.
Exactly.
So even if there is a data leak or something like that, that data is basically scrambled and impossible to get a hold of that way.
Traditionally, how we've seen the fraudster stealing card information is by putting a skimming device in gas stations or ATM machines, and then once you swipe your card, they collect the information, and then they use that to basically either create fake cards or load it to Apple Pay or use it to do a card not present transaction online activity. So that's how we've seen it in the industry.
Great. Okay. Well, this has been super enlightening. Just to leave on a note, if there's just a few best practices that you would suggest as a key takeaway from all of this, what are the main takeaways that you would suggest to people for keeping themselves safe from any type of fraud?
I would say that always fraud thrives and scam and fraud, they always thrive on speed. And usually it all goes away once you start slowing things down, take your time to think about things. And whenever in doubt, just hang up, just close out of a link. Don't look at the text and just call your financial institution immediately.
Thanks for joining me today, Subhi, and explaining all the unfortunate details of fraudsters, but obviously knowing what we now know from talking to you is great to have.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah. And we'll see you next time on Guiding You Forward.